Tonight is the third in the series of workshops for the Be Your Own Boss Bowl competition, and these are intended to cover topics that would be useful for you to help you prepare your submission for the competition, but also just generally useful for any entrepreneur that's thinking of starting up their business. Tonight, the workshop is going to be focused on developing your business model. A couple preliminary things. I cover this at the beginning of every workshop. This is the QR code to register your intent to submit. You do not have to register to submit to the competition, but we ask that you do so that we can gather some information from you, but also so that we can share some information with you. So once you've submitted or registered, I should say, once you've registered to, your intent to participate in the competition, we're going to send you a welcome email. And one of the important things in that welcome email is a link to our shared resources folder. In that shared resources folder, there are a whole bunch of great things for you to take a look at that I think will really help you prepare your submission. So we'll share some templates with you, some examples of previous submissions, a document with some tips about how to approach the competition, of course, the eligibility policies, the workshop video recordings and slides. So the slides from tonight's workshop, hopefully, Sean, you'll agree to share those with us. We can put them into that shared resource folder as well. And then you can go back. There are people that will register for our workshops, but they have scheduling conflicts with classes. And so they'll register and then they can go back in and get access to the video recordings and the links. So please, we encourage you to use that QR code back here. Make sure you register your intent to submit so that we can get you the information that will be helpful to you for your application. All right. Also, just to cover again, there's 3 elements to the submission. There's an executive summary, which is 1 to 2 pages, covering all the main topics that normally would be in a full business plan. We also ask you to submit an investor-style pitch deck, and then a 3-year financial projection, a simple P&L or income statement that shows what you're projecting your financials would look like for the next 3 years. Optionally, if you want to include drawings or a video, a short video that helps describe your idea and how you plan to deliver your value proposition, you can do that as well. And I also encourage you that when you do register, we ask you if you would like to be working with a mentor on our Startup Tree platform, which is our go-to platform that we use at the IEI and a temple for all things entrepreneurship. This is where you'll connect with mentors, schedule appointments, and use that to seek out the kind of help and expertise that you need to answer the questions that you have about starting up your business or something particularly in an area that maybe you really have concerns, you don't feel that you're strong enough yet, and you need that help. This is the place to get that help. So please utilize mentors. All right, with that, I want to introduce tonight our guest speaker, and that is Mr. Sean Boyce. He is the founder of NxtStep Consulting, but he also has, credited to his abilities, he's also founded Podcast Chef and also Staff Geek. And these are services, online services that he has available, that he offers to startup ventures, small businesses looking to really grow their businesses. So Sean's been out in the working world a while. He's a product of Drexel University. He's really been, he's very passionate about helping young entrepreneurs and helping them grow their businesses. I met Sean just about a month or 2 ago through a mutual connection. Was really impressed with the passion he brings to this and with his depth of knowledge, particularly in helping startups. And so I asked him if he'd be willing to come and meet with us to deliver one of our workshops tonight. So I'm thrilled to have him with us. I want to turn it over to you, Sean, tonight. I'm really eager to hear what you're going to be sharing with us and getting down into it. I know Sean would like this to be very interactive. So please, I encourage you to ask questions. He's going to go, I think, pretty quickly through a lot of topics, but don't hesitate to ask questions and ask him to go deeper where you have a particular interest. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate it very much to be here. Can you guys hear me okay? Just want to make sure the audio is coming in all right. Excellent. Let me know if not at any time. And it's nice to meet everyone. Thank you guys for having me. I'm excited to talk to you about what I hope you will find value out of, which includes what I've been involved in kind of throughout my career as I've built several businesses, with the general theme being business model for the most part. As Greg said, I really would love for this to be as interactive as you'd like it to be. So please, the time here is really yours. If you have questions about anything, even throughout the presentation, by all means, please feel free to just interrupt me and ask. You can raise your hand or just take yourself off of mute, say so. If you want to leverage the chat window as well too, I'll do my best to keep an eye on that. Feel free to drop questions in there and I can get to them when I get to a breaking point. Beyond that, I've got some visuals to kind of guide the conversation. As Greg said, I do have a lot that I can share with you. There's a lot that goes into a business model, which to me encompasses quite a bit related to your business. So I want to cover as much of that material as I can, but again, I want it to be as relevant to you as it possibly can be. So any feedback you guys have for me throughout, questions, please ask. Otherwise, when we get to good stopping points, I'll ask if anybody has any questions about anything we've covered so far. So having said that, let me go ahead and start by sharing my screen so I can walk you through some of these visuals, and then we'll get rolling from there. Here we go. And you should see business model, my name and my company logo on the screen. You can see that okay, Greg? I just want to make sure that the visual's coming in all right. Okay, cool. So I'm going to pull up the chat window too, just so I have it. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll do my best to keep track of that. Okay, so let's kind of dive in here, get through as much as we can. Greg, I know you shared thus far kind of my background and activity, and I appreciate that. Here it is again. I've also added the label for the different types of businesses each of these are and how they relate to one another. So NxtStep is my service-based business where I help people build product businesses. That typically falls into two different types. And at the moment, I have found that, and I'm currently running with a team, one of each type that I help people with, and really everything in between. So Staff Geek is a B2B SaaS business that's software as a service. Podcast Chef is a productized service where it's purchased, it's bought and sold like a product, but ultimately it's people behind the scenes following steps to deliver the value. So throughout the course of building businesses, both successfully and unsuccessfully, is a lot of the remainder of the content that you're going to find in here. So again, if you have any questions along the way, just let me know. That's where a lot of this expertise comes from. So before I move too much further, I want to kind of cover with you an overview of what I've learned throughout the course of starting starting several businesses, being successful with some and unsuccessful with others. And really it's this process, which you'll find on my NxtStep website, in terms of how the process should flow from what you're building business-wise. Everything starts with the problem. And what I'll also reinforce is that the product is at the tail end here. Product can be thought of whatever you might need to design, engineer, or build. Throughout this presentation, I'll reinforce that several times, but really what's most important is ensuring that you have what I refer to as a problem worth solving. Do you have a problem that causes significant enough pain for a customer for which they're willing to pay for a solution to, because what I refer to as the existing solution falls short? If you get to that stage, and only when you get to that stage, in my opinion, should you really be thinking about bringing a solution to market. You could do a lot of testing with a lot of cool tools, especially that are available nowadays towards the product end. Agreed. Yeah, well said, Greg. Thanks for that comment. It's all about the problem. Okay, so kind of diving more into business model, I like to start by kind of defining it. So as I would describe a business model to me, it's the process by which your business generates value for your customer and then captures some of that value for your business. So again, all in keeping with this theme of solving a problem worth solving and generating value for the customer. They receive an ROI from your product, and you only see product a lot. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be product as in something physical or software related. This could apply to services as well too, but I'll use product a little bit interchangeably that way. I just want you to be aware of that. So there should be value in it for your customer. Your customer should be paying for essentially what you're providing, and some of that value should be retained by your business. That's going to be your earnings, and that's how you're going to grow. So I want to help you realize this essentially. So I'm going to cover a number of different topics to try to do exactly that. So this is something that I'm working on at NxtStep, developing what I refer to as a product strategy roadmap. It may take a similar format from what you've seen before. I've stood on the shoulders of giants, and I've learned from my expertise what I would like to have on a version of this for myself. So this pulls from business model canvassing, lean canvassing, things like that, in order to kind of organize our efforts as we're building and growing our companies and making sure that we're prioritizing the right things in the right order. We can dive into more of that if anybody has any questions, but quite a bit of what's kind of organized here follows that format. And I know in some of these instances, you guys have covered some of this material already. So some of it I'll go into in a little bit more detail, and others we'll kind of jump around a little bit based on the questions that you might have. But first, I want to talk about what I think is the most important element, and that's your customer, right? Problem is really where I want you to start with your research, but you need to have someone to do that research with, and that's the customer. So in these sections, as I'm going to be presenting them, I've got essentially one question that I want you to answer for each of these topics before you move on to the next step in the process. And this is the question for the customer. Essentially, who has the problem that you intend to solve, and how are you going to connect with them? You need and in all of these instances, I'm going to talk in process oriented in terms of how you connect with and or make the kind of progress you need for your business. So when it comes to a customer, I want you to start thinking again in terms of the process, like how am I going to identify them? What do they have in common, right? I don't want you to be all things to all people, because if you tend to be all things to all people, you wind up kind of being nothing to anyone. It becomes very difficult to understand what it is that you're doing and the value, the problem that you're solving and the value that you're offering. So the more we can get specific in who your customer is and who your customer is not, the better that's going to be for you and your business. So I want to talk more about persona in a moment. But before I get into that, in terms of like how we can identify who the customer is, I want to talk about the different categories of customers and how you might start to think of them in terms of understanding the situation that you're going to be kind of entering into, and then proposing a new solution for in the form of your product or your service. There's different customer types. They're not all created equal. There may be a different user and buyer for what it is that you're doing, and you need to know where these differences are. Your user is someone who's going to interact with whatever your product or service may be. Your buyer, that is usually referred to kind of as the economic buyer. That's somebody who is ultimately going to be making the decisions. You can think of them as almost a decision maker in terms of whether or not this investment is worth it. Because in most of these instances, right, we're looking at them trading that some of their investment in terms of money for access to your solution in order to solve their problems. So this is some of the information here about what I'm referring to as that economic buyer, right? This person controls the budget. This person also is going to keep track of the ROI, which stands for return on investment. So if they're going to be investing $1 into your product or service, how much are they expected to get back? And it's important to think of things in this way, because it will help you grow in a number of different ways as you look to make progress with your business. So not all buyers are created equal. There's a resource that I recommend folks create. It's something that I've talked about a little bit. I refer to it as a persona map. So I'm going to talk about more about what a persona is. And when I say persona, what I mean is how can I identify who my customer is, like demographically. There are a number of categories you can use to identify who your customer is, to find them, identify them. It could be age, it could be geography, it could be the type of the work that they do, the industry that they compete in, the title of the job that they have. There's any number of different ways to learn everything you can learn about your customer. And the more detailed you can get, the better. It's going to make it easier for you to find them. And it's also going to be easier for any of the other investments you're making to try to capture their attention for them to find you. That's going to be really important for growth and gaining traction. The persona map, as I like to refer to it, is a way to kind of map how the different users and or different user types interact with one another at the situation in which you are going to be potentially proposing your new solution to solve a problem that they're experiencing. As in, if you're stepping into an operation, who does what there? I'll use my Staff Geek business as an example. So Staff Geek is a SaaS product. We provide a behavioral hiring assessment. So we are essentially screening for culture fit, so to speak. As part of a process of running an organization, usually there's two functions that we interact with. We interact with a recruiter, who does the hiring at the company. We interact with an HR professional, who sets a lot of the company policies. Those two user types have different objectives in terms of what they do for that organization, and it's important for us to pay attention to the needs of each, because we may not necessarily position what it is we do the same way to each person, because we want to address it specifically in terms of what's most important to them. So that's what a persona map is. I think that's a valuable resource. The watering hole element is something to indicate, I want you to think about where you can gain access to more customers of that type. So as you start to learn who the customer is and who they're not, how are you going to gain access to them? Ideally, as many of them as you can. It's an opportunity to perform discovery, to get a better understanding of the problems worth solving that they're experiencing, and how you can continually build this into a process where you're finding more and more customers to propose your solution to solve their problems. So that's another valuable element as well too. I have some material in here as well to talk through kind of the discovery process for how you essentially systematically go through identifying a problem worth solving. So I think you guys may have covered some of that material already, so I'm gonna hop over that and keep moving. If anybody's curious about that, drop a line in the chat or just ask, and I'll go into that detail as well too. So that would be for anyone who wants to know more about, basically, are you addressing a problem worth solving? Okay, so next, let's talk a little bit more about how you think through your market. You've probably heard of these acronyms before for this visual: TAM, SAM, SOM. The descriptions of what these are on this visual, as well as a description for what each is. But you know, your target market, or your total addressable market, serviceable, available, and serviceable obtainable. This is really to say that you want to have, you're going to need to know what this data looks like for your industry. This will also help you better understand, are you going too broad or are you going too narrow, right? For the most part, as a general rule of thumb, you know, a larger market is better, but you don't want to start immediately with a huge market because it's going to be particularly difficult in order to gain traction. So you're going to want to think of it in these different ways. And as you go down another level, your personas essentially will be updated, who you're speaking to, who you have access to, those things may change. You may not be able to immediately get into, you know, Fortune 500 company, but you may be able to get in and start talking with someone in the mid-market or a small to medium-sized business, start testing your solution. That's really what this is intended as a guide, is to get a better understanding of your market and how you can start gaining traction within your market. So I want you to think of it in this way, because I think that's valuable. Okay, so for the customer section, and I've got some homework elements listed in here as well too, in terms of what I would recommend you to do if you haven't already. Out of this one would be to create that persona map, get an understanding for all things your customer, your target market customer, all of the different user types that may operate at a business, for example, that you may be selling to if you're selling B2B, who each individual person is and what they're responsible for. Map that out to get a better understanding in how a day in the life for your customer operates today. So that's going to be very important for what you're doing with your own solution. Okay.
Sean?
Yes.
I'm not sure if this is the right place to ask this question, but I put a couple questions into the chat. I was wondering if you could maybe comment on a couple of those.
Absolutely. And thank you. Let's see here. Yeah, it's a good first one. I like that. Excellent. Thank you, Greg. Great questions. So generally speaking, how I would recommend going about, and for those that are curious about what the question was, it was really thinking through the market segments and which one ultimately you should address. Do you want to tackle them all at the same time, or do you want to go kind of one to the next? Ultimately, what I would recommend, and a lot of this advice comes from a great book I'd recommend as well too, Crossing the Chasm, which I would highly recommend folks get a copy of. The Chasm is an example of how you go from basically early momentum to the kind of scale that you need to plant, you know, in a significant way, your business on the map. As such, my recommendation is always to pick a specific, like, individual customer or market segment first to try to gain traction there as much as possible. When you're first starting out building something, often the misconception is that, I don't want to limit myself in terms of who I can help. As such, people have a tendency to go broad. The problem with that is you're doing something new. And for the most part, people don't know what it is that you're doing. So it's going to be difficult in order to kind of gain traction. As such, instead of trying to boil the ocean, as the analogy goes, go a little bit smaller, because it's going to help you with everything from, I call, conversations. So really copy to conversations. So everything you write about what it is that you do, which is a lot of your marketing effort, and then your conversations as well too, which essentially is part of your sales effort. So communicating what you do, who you can help, and getting connected to the right folks as you're building momentum. The smaller you go is usually the better in order to help you build momentum. Then once you reach a certain amount of penetration in a market, once you've gotten enough traction in the vertical that you started with, at that point, it's worthwhile to consider expansion into others, but not before that. You want to make sure that you have you've captured enough of that market that before you start adding new ones to it to grow from there. Does that do a pretty good job of covering what you were thinking, Greg, on that topic?
Yeah, and doesn't it also, don't you think also that when you're talking to or presenting to investors, it also shows a sense of realism? I think oftentimes investors look at someone who's got a solution that could be targeted to multiple markets. And when you say, we're going to launch, we're going to go after all these markets, the investor looks at you and listens and says, yeah, you think you are, but maybe you shouldn't. And so it's also a good way of positioning yourself, of being a little more savvy, because you're not trying to eat the elephant in one bite. You're trying to eat the elephant one bite at a time, right? So, and then what about the second part of that is, since you did suggest that maybe they look at a specific target market. So when they've got 3 or 4, we'll keep it simple, or 2 or 3 market segments that they could go after, what are the factors that you think they should be thinking about in terms of how they would determine, well, which one is the right one to go after first?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The short answer is you want to do a little bit of trial and error. You're going to want to identify the potential market segments that you may be able to apply your solution to. Think of it from an industry perspective. I'll use Staff Geek as another example. Right? We've attempted a number of different things. We've attempted to sell into professional services, healthcare, and retail. So 3 different potential segments of a market, right, in terms of what we do and who we help. Long story short there, as we have had a number of at-bats for each, we've been able to measure, how well do we adequately solve the problem? What was the customer's kind of reaction to that? What type of ROI were we able to provide to them? Basically, how did we perform? And what we found out was that we were able to really move the needle in a big way in the retail industry. And so much of the kind of stars aligned well in that industry for our solution because of the current market needs, which is retail at the moment is really struggling to hire as much as they can. As such, it's very expensive when they lose someone or someone turns over. Our product just so happens to be basically the ideal solution for that problem. As such, the virality of our ability to kind of grow in that specific market segment is stronger than the other 2. So a little bit of experimentation goes a long way, and you can kind of measure the performance there in order to figure out how you might move forward or which one you might choose first. So don't be afraid to do a little bit of experimentation if you have a few that you are considering, and then pit the performance of them against one another. Try to test your product in those different market segments and evaluate the results. I like to be very data-driven, so I like to be able to kind of see it in the numbers and know where the traction is. So that's one great way. And then in ways to figure out the different segments is I would use something like the product strategy roadmap to say, either there looks like there is plenty of opportunity and that, in this space, there is a problem worth solving here for sure through customer discovery data. And that's one-on-one qualitative conversations with folks in that market segment, or there isn't, right? So you can compare different, I've got this visual kind of up here. You can compare different segments together as the type of problems that exist in each segment for which your product or your service is intended to be an adequate solution. So this visual here is intended to give you the idea that as you're identifying problems, those become buckets in this analogy. And then as you find instances of those problems, with other people in that target market. The marble represents the problem and as such goes into the bucket. So this is a potential helpful construct to think through how you might evaluate comparing one segment to another.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, great question. Okay, keep the questions coming, guys. I want to make sure that this is as valuable as it can be for everybody that's here. So we talked customer. I want to talk problem just for a moment, not too long. I know you guys have done a bit here, but there's a couple of things I'd recommend from the perspective of making sure that you are solving the right problem. I talked about this problem worth solving concept. There's more to dive into here, but I just want to make sure I reinforce this, that you understand what I mean when I say a problem worth solving. I run a podcast called Product Launch that I will recommend and share with you guys in addition to these notes. And I just recorded an episode for someone who, built a product that was ultimately unsuccessful, basically because customers were unwilling to pay for the solution they were working on. And after having learned that fact as part of their second, basically, foray into building another product type business, they have been so successful, they have $1 billion backlog at this point, essentially, with what they're doing. And I can share more about that story because it's fascinating. I would just listen to that podcast episode. But one of the things that they reinforced was making sure that you have a problem for which your customer is willing to pay for a solution to that problem. That advice is really worth its weight. If people are willing to use your product, usually that's not enough. They need to be willing to pay for your product or your solution. If they're unwilling to do that, I would say keep moving. Go back to that buckets and marbles analogy and find find an actual problem worth solving. So to me, problem isn't worth solving unless someone is willing to pay for access to your solution. Now, there's other ways to kind of figure out whether or not you've got a good problem. This is one that I love, the kind of Google it problem. If you're talking to someone in a target market who's convinced that they have a problem that they need solved, ask them what they've searched for in order to find a solution to that problem. If they can't come up with anything, as in, I don't know, or I haven't, another indication that it's not really a problem. You need a way to be able to measure the significance of the pain of those problems that they're reporting. And if they're not searching for solutions to them, more than likely it is also not a problem worth solving. So there's a couple of tricks to consider when it comes to doing those types of things as well too. So as it pertains to problems, ensure that you have a problem worth solving for which a customer is willing to pay for. That's also going to be key to your business model. Without someone paying for your solution, you don't really have a business. It's more of a hobby. So make sure that you're doing that. Okay, I'm going to touch on existing solution for a moment. This gets back into that kind of persona map of better understanding your customer, but it's how they're solving the problem that you're supposed to solve better today. That's what I refer to when I'm saying existing solution. There's a cool story here about TurboTax, which is a software product made by the company Intuit, which you're probably familiar with. But when they tell the story of TurboTax, they are usually doing so in front of an audience, Intuit that is, and they ask a question to the audience in terms of, what was TurboTax competing against when they were building that product, when we were building that product? A lot of the answers they get are just random e-file this and e-file that related to different types of software products trying to do something similar that TurboTax ultimately did. The punchline that is usually surprising to a lot of folks is pen and paper. That was the existing solution they were competing against. So at the time, Intuit knew that most people are filling the returns out by hand. So they didn't have to be better than any other kind of software company. They needed to beat the existing solution, which was what most people were doing, and that was filling returns out by hand. So you need to understand the existing solution. Otherwise, if and when you get to kind of the product or engineering phase, we don't want you building something that doesn't beat the existing solutions. That perspective is really important. Okay, so there's more in the existing solution section to dive into in terms of measuring that. But ultimately, the key is really, follow the pain. I've got this visual here. Basically measure where there's opportunity to make improvements. And that will give you a better perspective for how much room you have to beat the existing solution, right? In terms of lost time, lost money, what is the problem costing them? What is the impact of the problem? That's going to give you healthy perspective to have a better understanding for how well you can, how much better your solution can be than whatever the existing solution is. All right. So the homework on the solution section is all about quantifying where the existing solution falls short. So have a better understanding in terms of how much you can legitimately beat the existing solution that your customer is using to solve their current problem. Okay, so let's get into value proposition.
Sean, before you
Yes,
move on, if I could interrupt again, sorry. Could you go back a slide?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, just
this one.
Yep. So I think one of the things here, when you're talking about where do existing solutions fall short. So we talked previously about doing competitive research and preparing a competitive grid that shows, where your product or your solution stacks up against your main competitors, and that competitors can be direct competitors, indirect, or as you point out, just the existing solution, what's the status quo, right? But also alternatives and substitutes, things that really aren't close to the solution, but it's still a way of solving that problem, right? One of the things that I think if you could talk to it in terms of doing the competitive analysis and looking at where solutions fall short. So what do you do, or what can you do when you do your research and you find out that there is somebody out there that's already doing something pretty similar to what you're doing? What would you suggest they do? Do they abandon, do they jump ship and run for another problem, or is there something else that they could be doing or looking at to see how they could gain a competitive advantage? Because I think oftentimes people come up with these great ideas and then they Google it and they find, oh, there's like 6 other things out there already.
Well said. And that's a great question. So there's a couple things I want to mention about this one, right? If you're earlier on in the process and whatever your vision is, there's something that's exactly like that that's out there, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't move forward with, potentially that idea, right? Doing discovery around that idea, because it's entirely possible. I mean, that it's a big world out there. There's a lot of problems. Most of them go unsolved, even where there are existing solutions with a lot of traction. Staff Geek is a good example of that, because there are 3 companies going up against us who have been in the industry for 60 years, 3 separate companies that have been there for decades. We've been around for about 7 years. And compared with at least one of them, we eat their lunch all the time. Whenever people are considering purchasing from that product versus ours, most of the time they purchase from ours. But it's because of how we've positioned our product, and we've designed our business model and our value proposition around where that existing solution, in this case, one of these incumbent products that a lot of folks have used previously, falls short, and where most of the complaints about that product are. Our advantage in this case is because they've been around and doing business the same way for so long, and they're so big, they're not as agile as we are. So we can make adjustments according to what the market needs are much more quickly than they ever could. As such, you're going to want to basically leverage your strengths when it comes to being competitive. And that's, how agile can you be? Well, you may be a team of 1 or 2 or a small team. You can make changes whenever you'd like to. Some of these bigger companies with a lot more history won't be able to do that. The other thing I want to reinforce is don't be, to me, I think competition for the most part is a good thing. I see it as validation of the space that you're considering entering. I am very nervous if anyone says to me, I don't have any competitors. If that's the case, you are doing something you shouldn't be doing, or you haven't done enough research, because almost everyone has tried to build almost everything at this point. There's been a lot of attempts, successful and unsuccessful, right? It doesn't mean the timing's not an element. If you hear the founders of Airbnb, for example, tell their story, which I think they do a better job of being a little bit more honest than most, they say it took them 5 years to become an overnight success, right? For years, people don't think about them getting tossed out of offices and people's homes, trying to communicate their value proposition, right? They had to do a lot of educating. So if you don't have a competitor, it's a lot harder than you think. It could be very lucrative and rewarding, but it's a road that I wouldn't recommend for anyone. So some competition is a good thing. Beyond that, as you're selling your product, as you're talking to folks about your value proposition and positioning it better than the existing solutions, listen to your customer, listen to what they say. How are they solving these problems? What products are they aware of? When people come to Staff Geek, like when we get leads and I have conversations with folks, I ask them, are you considering any other products? Most of the time they say no. And most of the time they are completely unaware of whatever products are already out there. So I think we have a tendency to hyper focus on our competitors. Chances are, in most instances, I think we know our competition better than our customers do. So it depends on the space that you're in, of course, but the perspective that matters is your customer's perspective, not necessarily ours. As such, there are other products out there doing similar things that Staff Geek does. We believe our value proposition is unique. So we get the ability to make sure that it stays unique by addressing the most important needs in the market. But we do that by listening to our customers, not obsessing over our competitors and making sure that we're chasing them or differentiated from them or anything like that. The customer's word is ultimately what I recommend you listen to and respond to as well.
I also just threw another tip in the chat, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point. The benefits is important. The ROI, especially as it pertains to your business model, is important for a lot of reasons, right? I would love your customer to get both tangible and intangible benefits from your product when compared with whatever the existing solution may be. The more value that your customer is getting out of what you're doing, without leaving money on the table and giving everything away, the better. It makes your product stickier. So as Greg, as you just said, focusing on the benefits versus the features, I think is very important, because you could throw features at something all day, right? But 90%, upwards of 90% of the features that are built in software, for example, are never touched by anyone. So the vast majority of software development effort is wasted. As such, I want you to be ultra conservative with what you build into your product. If you fall into those traps and you're adding features and functionality to your product, and 9 out of 10 of what you're adding is not used, it makes the experience worse for everyone. It doesn't add value, and all you're doing is burning dev cycles and spending time and money that you shouldn't be. So focus on those benefits. You have to stay close to your customer. Everything should be defined essentially by what your customer needs are, especially in the beginning. Good questions. Thank you, Greg. And if anybody else has any other questions, please feel free to jump in. I'm going a little quickly. I'm trying to make sure you guys get as much of this content as possible, but it's definitely going to be, I want it to be better for you. So ask away, man. The time is really yours whenever you do have one.
Can I just ask you to go back one slide? I just want to
Of course.
Just quantify. So you said there's 3 things you want to quantify, like following the pain. So listening for frustration, calculate lost time. What was the third?
Yes, sure. So this one. So I talked about lost time or money. Basically, it's whether or not you can help your customer recoup time or money, or you can essentially generate more revenue for them. That's usually the 3 that I focus on. You can, obviously give them more time back, but that comes in the fact of like giving back the time that they were losing before. And in this analogy, you can get everything down to a number, because in this case, time is money, right? And there's a way to quantify the time savings that your product is ultimately able to provide by understanding how the existing solution works, right? So I'll give you one kind of working example. If the problem that you solve is today solved by people at your customer, and it takes 10 people, an hour a day or over the course of a week in order to solve that problem, now you're talking about, right, 10 times 1 per every week, that's 10 hours, right? So 10 hours they're putting into solving that problem today. If your product, and that's just a week, let's say we use just 4 weeks for a month to keep it relatively easy numbers, right? Now we're talking about 40 hours goes into solving that problem with the existing solution today. You can use standard numbers for what it costs to pay those folks in order to solve those problems. Good rule of thumb can be, between $50 and $100 an hour, so to speak, because it incorporates salary and benefits and all that other kind of stuff, plus lost productivity, opportunity cost, right? If we use, just 100 to make things simple, we're talking about a problem that costs them upwards of $4,000 a month, right? So now I run this calculation in this equation to set a baseline, but that doesn't necessarily mean we can go right in there and charge a product for $4,000 a month and they're going to be over the moon about paying for that, right? A rule that I would love for you to follow, because I've seen this in what I've studied, I've seen this leveraged very successfully in terms of gaining traction, is this one here in terms of calculating kind of the ROI of your solution to their problem. The 10X rule is great to follow. A lot of the products that have had aggressive growth have done so by providing a 10X rule. And what that means is, in this case, that sample I walked through, that problem costs $4,000. If you charge less than $400 for your product, they're going to get a 10 times return on their investment. If, when you check those numbers against the customer, they say that those are fair. Like you run this exercise in calculating what that existing solution costs them, and then you check it against them, right? We run the numbers, but then we ask them, and they might say, we say, well, you've got 10 people, an hour a day, 20-ish calendar days, your working days in a month. I'm looking at, $100 an hour, whatever. That equates to me, based on my numbers, about $4,000 a month. That problem, it's costing you to solve that problem. They might say, well, more like $50 an hour or whatever, or something. Anyway, it might come down to $2,000. They might say, yeah, $2,000 sounds about right. Yeah, I mean, based on your numbers, I would agree. And if that's the case, that's your new baseline. That's your number to beat. So now your number is, if you want a 10X return, anything less than $200, if you can provide as a solution, that's a win for them all day, right? And then if all you have to do is prove that you can do that, and that's like, rocket ship territory. You can grow pretty aggressively if you're able to solve problems that are that expensive for an ROI that's that aggressive. Good question. Any other questions for anybody so far? Otherwise, I'll just keep going. Cool. That was a good one. So here, just staying on that topic, this is kind of what I was just referring to in terms of how to measure the existing solution. We walked through that example, so we don't need to jump into that again, but I call it the value equation. Calculate the value equation in terms of what the existing solution is costing your customer to solve that problem today, right? And again, if any of this data doesn't exist, you need to keep looking for a different problem, because this data should be very well known. You're going to want your customer to not just know this problem intimately well, but how they're solving it today, what it's costing them, and what they're trying to do to improve it, right? The more money, the more dollars they're putting in to trying to solve this problem and coming up short, the better it is for you. So you're going to want to see them be, the more active they are trying to solve this problem and the more frustrating that process is for them, the better it is for you. If it's if you bring up I solve this problem and it almost feels like it's come out of left field, you've either got the wrong customer or the wrong problem, and you need to adjust that. Your customer hearing about your solution to their problem should be music to their ears if you've got everything well aligned. If not, you need to go back and take a look at how you've designed everything and kind of reevaluate. Okay, keep the questions coming. These are good ones. So I want to jump around a little bit with value proposition. So we talked about this, right? Same concept. Don't need to probably dive into that too much more again, but what are you providing as an ROI? That's a key element of your business model, right? So plus it goes well with a story that you might need to tell to an investor or someone who maybe, if you're raising capital or anything like that, they're going to want to know that this is a solution cold, right? You know what your customer is comparing you against, and they want to know how much value can you provide to the customer. Any of the proof that goes along with that is only going to aid you in your effort. And at that point, they'll know you know what you're doing. This positioning element is key for your value proposition as well too. You need to be able to articulate why yours is able to provide that much better of a solution, right? If you have that kind of data that I just went through in terms of the value equation, right? I know what the existing problem cost is down to the penny. You can then talk to them about how yours is going to avoid that, right? So that equation that I just gave, you need to paint for them the story of here's how their life is dramatically improved with access to our solution, basically. Bonus points if you can also prove that through with social proof and any case studies. So as part of a pilot phase, which again, should always be paid, folks have used it and you've gotten to evaluate the results of it. That's the last piece of the puzzle, essentially. So if you're talking to an investor about what you do, and you're armed with, the customer, the persona, where they hang out, the problem, the existing solution, the value equation. The next big piece of that is the proof. Prove to me that you can do that. If you've done that with pilot customers, by the time, and generated revenue, and you've got the results of it, and you've got customers that are profusely complimentary, that is music to, investors' ears. They know you're following the process you should be, and that you've lined up the dots to the extent where basically where I want you to be is in a position that you don't need the investor capital, but if you had investor capital, you could grow faster. And that's what investors are looking for too. They're not necessarily looking for, they're looking for a return on their investment. They want to spend basically as little money as possible in order to receive as much money as possible. So the return is what they're interested in. So the more attractive these numbers are, and the more they think that you're doing, including having all this data, the more interested they're going to be to cut a check and help you grow. But if you can show to them, I've started a small fire all by myself, right? I've got that kind of traction. We're making money, we're cash flow positive, whatever. We've got a small operation, but we can grow off operations. Then, they're going to ask, okay, well, what can you do with more, right? Can you repeat? Can you replicate this at scale? And that answer should also be yes. But anyway, that's kind of how I would recommend kind of telling that story. Okay, so this element here is really like to compare and contrast the different revenue model options, which in the world that I compete and what's most common today, there's really a few. You can sell based on fixed fee. What's ever becoming ever more popular and has for years at this point is the subscription elements to your revenue model. The pay-per-user I would categorize as kind of a subset of the subscription model, where you have the ability to grow as the user base grows. But keep in mind that this isn't always appropriate. Like, it's very attractive from a revenue generating and growth perspective, but you don't want it to be something that deters people from using the product in the first place, right? The key is to solve a problem we're solving, then get people who are using your product so you can get the feedback in terms of whether or not it's working, right? That social proof. Then, and only beyond that, is it going to be more about, all right, how do I get more people using the product and generating revenue and growing from there? You're talking software already. Your margins will be solid. Your margin should be solid because the profit margin of software companies is typically pretty high, traditionally pretty high. I want to share one other example of a product company that, from a competition perspective, we talked about this a little bit earlier, Greg, that I think is a really interesting element in terms of how they've done that. So if anybody here is familiar with DuckDuckGo, it's a search engine that places an emphasis on privacy and not tracking you and doing shady things with your data, and basically the opposite of what some of those other product companies are out there trying to do with your data, right? Which is becoming becoming more and more into the limelight as things like GDPR grab a stronghold and so on and so forth. So I don't know how familiar you guys are with Google and their business model, but the vast majority of the revenue comes from ads. It's basically ads, which is placement via search, one of their key products, etc. Nicely done. Agreed. Yep. Good vote of confidence there for DuckDuckGo. And so the majority of Google's revenue comes from ads, right? And they track you. They follow you around. They have your data. They know what you're doing, and they use that to basically update that experience and sell for more money to those that want to place ads. DuckDuckGo, on the other hand, they do some of those things, but not all of them. They have a promise not to track you, not to follow you around, not to track your data. So what they're not doing, how it's different from an experience perspective is, you're not going to see basically that whatever piece of sports equipment or a car or dress or whatever that you looked at however long ago, following you around the internet everywhere, because they're not selling that data to anyone else. You might see an ad for one of those things if you actively search for it, which is kind of the idea, right? Because at the moment you're searching for that. So what's really interesting here is, like, DuckDuckGo entered a space where there was already, the game was essentially considered to have already been won, right? Google was the vast majority, dominated the search engine space, of course. But because of how they designed their value proposition, in order for Google to enter into the space and compete with DuckDuckGo, Google would have to cannibalize their own business model, which is how they make the vast majority of their revenue, which is extremely unlikely, right? they're not going to give away their golden goose in order to compete with another product out there on the market, because that is their business. So I think I just thought that was a really creative, innovative way to kind of position yourself against the competition. And it's an example of such that, like, it really doesn't matter what market and what competitors are already in there. DuckDuckGo has continued to be successful and gaining in popularity. I wouldn't typically recommend going up against, massive competition to start, but the point is that you can. That's all. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about, because I've expertise in the product space. How are we doing on time so far, Greg? I just want to do a quick time check. Oh, you may be muted, Greg.
Sorry, yeah, it's 5:06. Okay,
cool. How much more time do I have to keep going?
You can go for as long as you want. It just depends on whether or not how much time you'll have at the end for any other questions.
Sure, sounds good.
We try to wrap up at about 6:30.
Okay, great. Let me go through two more elements here, and then I want to, if there's questions along the way, by all means, just ask, and then I'll pause to ask for a couple of questions. I want to see if I can get through some more of this conversation. So one thing I want to talk about is basically like when you build, if you're working on your solution, right? I mentioned the process kind of earlier. I want you to resist the urge as much as possible. Building your solution, investing in engineering, building your product. There's a lot you can do with a lot of tools that are already on the market, which can help you move fast and keep your spend way down. Don't rush to build. I would rather you rubber band something together and push it to the breaking point before you go build expensive custom software. I have done it myself. Staff Geek did it. I connected basically Typeform to a bunch of Google Suite products, and we had dozens of customers paying us to use that before we built the major version of software that we have today. Right? Your customer isn't really going to care how much time and money you invested into building your software. They only care whether or not you can solve their problem. And we did, right? It wasn't pretty, and I'm an engineer. Like I really always wanted it to be better and nicer and whatever, but my customer didn't care. So as such, I didn't care, right? So you gotta let those like personal elements go. This is a trap, right? Building products is a trap. It's a big one. It sinks a lot of product companies. And it's not that it can't benefit you. It's possible that it's that you're not going to have enough data potentially to know exactly what you should build that early. So you need to spend more time with the customer, understanding the problem space, learning about all these things before you get around to bringing solutions to market. So resist this urge as much as possible. If you even think that it's like too early to build, you're right. Whether you think that or not, you're more than likely right. And if you're ever not sure and you're about to cut a big check to build some software, call me in the middle of the night. I don't care if I'm sleeping, and I'll talk you off that ledge, because it's just not something you need to worry about until it's obvious, right? You got customers ready to like tossing money your way to get access to your solution. Then it's time to start thinking about, okay, how are we going to build this, right? But exactly how should it work? But even before that, you can do a lot with prototypes. You can do a lot with solution design before you get there. These elements I want you to consider as well too, right? It doesn't have to be software right out of the gate. That might be where you ultimately want to go, but you can offer solutions as services or productized services first. Because again, all your customer cares about is whether or not you're ultimately solving their problem. Staff Geek started out this way. It went from service to productized service, then to product. It wasn't always a software product it is today, because again, the customer didn't care. All they cared about is whether or not they were ultimately going to get their problem solved. So as part of what Staff Geek does, we generate reports based on essentially candidates applying for positions, right? We establish a baseline. That report compares them against one another in terms of whether or not they're going to be a fit at that company. So what we did in the beginning was, we said that the reports would be sent in an automated way, and that was true. But behind the scenes, myself and my co-founder, we were creating the reports manually for a while. Now we had some like long nights, a couple of nights in a row, and it drove us crazy. But we had a standardized process that we built, which would provide the value to the customer. And before we invested in automating that, we did it manually. because we wanted to measure with those pilot customers, were they getting the kind of value out of it? Were they going to continue to use it, or was it not going to solve their problem? Once we validated, after putting a couple of hours into it over a couple of days, that it did in fact validate and solve their problem, then and only then did we automate that step. But at that point, we knew exactly what it needed to be in software. So we were very opinionated about what to build. That's another trap when it comes to building products, is people just don't know, exactly what it needs to be or what it doesn't need to be before that, right? I had customers paying me. I had customers using the basically rubber banded together version of my product. And I knew what it needed to do and what it didn't need to do when it was time to automate it. And I could also start small. I could automate one piece. I don't have to automate the whole thing, right? Because it's about the experience. It's not about any one feature or the product itself. Yeah, great story in there as well too, Greg. Thank you for sharing that. I know a lot of people, myself included, whose products or ultimate companies have kind of been torpedoed by wasting a lot of budget and wasting a lot of time building stuff. If anything, take that time and money saved, keep your spend as low as possible until you get to a breaking point for whatever it is you do have, and you've got decent amount of customers paying you. Then and only then is it time to start thinking about the solution design elements. There's also other great tools out there that are gaining great traction. Bubble.io is a great one. That's the website. So Bubble.io is almost like an ecosystem where through mainly no code, you can put a software product together through like drag and drop, almost like you build a website with WordPress. You can build a full web application. You can take payments, you can do everything, right? And non-technical members, they have great resources for how to build this stuff. You can do so yourself, right? I want you to build something in Bubble, and I want you to break it because so many customers are using it and paying you for it, that now the only way you can grow is by building a better version of that, ultimately that scales, and then at that point, you'll know exactly what you need to build and not build. So your spend will be well preserved.
Just out of curiosity on Bubble, you could then publish that to clients, and that's something that you could actively launch.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a product operating on Bubble right now, actually, and it does both web and mobile. It handles payments. It does everything. I have even myself, even though I have software engineering background, at one point I was evaluating using an existing product for a business wanted me to help them with the digital transformation project going from one software to the other. I found one that I liked a lot. And even I was unable to tell that the product was built in Bubble because it was so well done that I had no idea. And I've written code for years. I'm using this thing and I'm thinking this is great. It's got the features I want, it solves my problems. I'm ready to buy this thing. And we ended up using it, but I tracked down, I was trying to find where the company was and I couldn't find much about the company. Turned out it was just it was a guy. It was a young guy, just one. He was Delaware or something, but he had done an amazing job with this platform, and it was indistinguishable in my experience from it, better in many ways than the other custom software products that were out there at the time that I was also looking at. So yeah, you can do a lot with these platforms.
That's incredible. I know it can vary so much based on the features you want to put in, but in terms of what you think the cost difference could be, in your experience, how much difference have you seen going a route a low code route versus custom build out?
Yeah, and it depends on who you talk to. That the custom dev shops are going to tell you, well, you can't do that for this reason and whatnot. It's like if you ask, I used to be a mechanic way back in the day, and I used to say, if you want 4 opinions, ask 3 mechanics. Someone's going to have 2 opinions. So that depends. So take my advice with a grain of salt. But I'm obviously very much on one side where I'm going to resist building as much as I can because I just know it's a trap. I've fallen into it. Having said that, you can save tens of thousands, if not, I've seen people save hundreds of thousands of dollars using these no-code platforms. And really, this can be for, depending on what your product does, right, the complexity. Now, if you're doing machine learning and AI and you're heavy data crunching and stuff like that, this Bubble is not intended to be efficient, right? So it's not going to scale to hundreds or thousands of customers more than likely, at least not to the experience that you want. But if you're at that phase, then that's a great problem to have, right? All you need to do now is figure out, okay, it's clearly effective. Now I need to figure out how to make it efficient. And because you have a prototype and people using things like a Bubble that you can build for way cheaper, you will be able to see who's using what. some people are using this and I have to have that. Nobody's using this as such. Okay, when I build the custom software, definitely don't build that. Definitely do build this, that type of stuff. That step is often missing from these projects, and that's where they go sideways. They build something heavy duty right out of the gate, and then, just like I said before, 90% of it doesn't get used or doesn't solve the problems or whatever. And a lot of the companies that fail, startup companies that fail, upwards of 9 out of 10, I would say do so not because they didn't have traction or they weren't on the right track. It's because they ran out of time, money, or both before they could pivot into figuring out more of a problem solution product market fit. And the leading cause, in my opinion, of running out of that time and money is wasting too much time building stuff when you're not ready, and wasting too much money building stuff when all that time should be spent selling, talking to customers, understanding their problems, getting your value proposition really strong. And then, going through some solution design and using tools like this to build something that you can do much faster and much more cost effectively.
In terms of like conversion, when you come to that day when you're ready to switch like away from, if you reach that scale or whatever, do you know how like that works? Like, would you have to necessarily like have your customers like convert to another platform, like risk, losing some traction? Like, do you know how that process works?
Yeah, it's usually like building a new bridge. If you've ever seen kind of how that process works, from time to time, bridges infrastructure wise, it just deteriorates. It only has a certain like shelf life. As such, you need to replace it. And also like migratory patterns change and different people in different areas. And as such, we need bigger capacity. So if you need to replace a bridge, what you typically do is you build the new bridge alongside that bridge, then you redirect the flow of traffic to the new bridge. And then after you redirect the flow of traffic to the new bridge so that you don't disrupt the traffic, now you can decommission and remove the old bridge, so to speak. It's the same type of thing if you need to do a rebuild of your entire platform. You should be pretty much regularly making at least minor changes, so your customers should be aware of that at that point. When it comes to a major change, it's a relatively similar process. Just inform them, well in advance of a launch that's upcoming, and realistically, it should be a good thing. Just like when most people look forward to new infrastructure being available with twice as many lanes or something like that. So it should be an advantage of yours. And they should be relatively comfortable with that as well too, as long as the process is kind of well managed. And you'll know when the time is right, when you just keep running into little things that are driving you crazy, like you're wasting too much time, or the performances, people are complaining about performance or something like that. That's when, I would say is a good time to start thinking about, and I'm very conservative with this, that's a good time to start thinking about making investment into something more substantial.
Thanks so much. That's incredibly helpful.
Good, glad. Excellent question. Again, I'm also going to share my contact information with you guys too. So if you guys have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me about any of the stuff or your own like personal situations as well. Anybody else have any other questions about the prototyping stuff before I move on to the next topic? Okay, cool. So I've got a topic on sales. Yeah, let's talk about the topic on sales since we're talking business model. So when it comes to sales for your product, I want you to think of it in terms of building a process. I want you to think of everything in terms of building a process, but sales in particular. I think a lot of folks, and I've written about a lot of this content recently, think of sales as like a person or a personality. In my opinion, I reject that. It can exclusively be process oriented and very scientific. So that kind of begs the question, okay, like what are the steps then? So these to me are the steps in building an effective sales process. And I've got some recent content on that. Actually, I think it's linked on the slide. So when you guys get a copy of the slide, follow those links, because I've got both detailed articles I've written up about this, as well as free templates for building your own sales process and examples from my own companies for the processes I've built. I think these examples were for Podcast Chef, which is podcasting as a service. I've got free assets and templates that you guys can use to kind of build your own. But these are the steps that you want to follow in order to build a sales process. Number one, do you have problem solution fit, right? Does your solution work to effectively solve the problem? Is it effective first? Second is repeatability in your process. Based on the sales process you've built, as a number of prospects flow through that process, are you able to convert a predictable number of prospects into paying customers that flow through your sales process? So if I talk to 10 prospects, I know I get 3 paying customers on average, right? That's exactly what I'm talking about. If you're able to get that kind of data, put dozens of customers through the process, now it's repeatable. It might just be you doing it or a small team or whatever, so it may not be efficient yet, but it's effective and it's repeatable and consistent. So that's step 2. Then step 3 is all about scalability. Like, how do I take that to a higher level, right? If you've built this as a process, now you can leverage greater economies of scale, greater resources. You can add capacity, right? That might look like you putting more time into it because maybe you weren't doing it full time before. You can hire folks, you can introduce some kind of automation, whatever. Different resources you can pull into the mix at that point to reach a greater level of scale. But having built this as a process is going to be important because others should be following the same process so that you can do things like keep the standard of quality high, protect your brand, and measure the performance of how well everyone is doing, right? So you built the process, you know what the results look like. Now, as you start to delegate that to other team members or build a team around it, you know what to expect in terms of performance so that you can keep track of who may need more help or what changes might need to be made. Then as you continue to grow through 3, you'll reach 4, which is essentially product market fit, which I consider to be more of a phase because both of the elements of product market fit are dynamic. Your product is more than likely regularly changing and your market is always changing. So it's something that you have to always constantly keep an eye on. That's why I'm such a big proponent of staying close to your customer and collecting as much of that data as possible, because it's going to help you evaluate whether or not you are still there or you're on your way. But if scalability is working effectively for you, then you'll be well on your way to product market fit. So that's what I recommend building in terms of sales process. I have slides here for the other elements in terms of how to do them. But we could pretty much jump over those because they kind of just reinforce some of the things I was already talking about. I mentioned repeatability, consistency in the performance, making it predictable, scalability, the divide and conquer element, making sure you're keeping track of quality and maintaining that feedback loop, which means as whoever is running your sales process is learning more about communicating your value proposition, the problems in the space, they're providing that feedback to everybody else in your team, letting them know, hey, I'm getting a lot of customers asking about this feature or that feature, or they have this problem now. We don't have a solution for that. We should build it. That's the kind of data that should influence your engineering department or what you do with your product, right? We want to bring solutions to market and we want to maximize the efficiency and ROI of our spend anywhere, but especially with engineering. So we want a bunch of customers lined up, ready and waiting to use whatever it is we're thinking about building before we build it. And that is entirely possible. So I recommend that as well too.
Go back one slide for just a sec.
Yeah, of course. This one?
No, it was the
This one.
repeatability. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, this one.
All right, thank you.
Cool, you got it. All right, so that's the repeatability element. We talked about scalability as well too. That feedback loop is invaluable. It's basically helping you continuously test the process. So encourage that early and often as well too. Anybody that's spending time with customers, you should be doing everything you can to kind of organize that data. And I'm working on stuff here myself as well too to make this process easier, but it has heavy influence on everything that you do all over your company. Okay, we talked about revenue here, value equation, return on investment, different revenue streams. So this is another area. We talked about market segmentation in terms of like starting specifically, gaining momentum and traction in one segment, and then using that to jump to potentially other segments or evaluate what the next segment is you might want to identify. So in that Staff Geek story I told earlier, where we're starting with retail, or we're staying very active in retail, the other ones we considered healthcare or professional services. Once we gain enough traction in retail, we might look to one or more of the other ones in terms of what we address next, but we won't tackle 2 at the same time. It's still going to be one, then it's going to be another one. And then once we reach enough market penetration there, we'll consider a third. But that's generally the process. Okay, so that's the revenue element. Different revenue streams is another component that you want to keep an eye on as you are making progress, because you're going to find potentially new opportunities to generate revenue. As you're developing relationships with these customers, as they're consistently using your product, they're going to be identifying other areas where they may need more help. And they're going to be sharing them with you. If you've got a good feedback loop integrated as part of this process, you're going to be identifying these opportunities. As such, they could be opportunities for you to generate more revenue. That may come in the way of additional features or additional components, which may give you the ability to charge more or build solutions to the problems that they now have. It could also be a complement from other options that I mentioned previously. I mentioned service, product, and productized service. Another model that I'm bullish on is having complementary services with your product, because there are limitations. Basically, there's strengths and weaknesses to software and service. Right? Service is managed by people, which essentially can be anything. So you can pivot that very easily, and typically can charge higher price points because service solutions are often more custom. The product, on the other hand, is traditionally a little bit more cost effective, so it's priced a little bit lower because the solutions are more automated, which enables you to reach greater scale, but it doesn't mean that it's going to do everything for everyone you may want to help. So there's other areas to look for in terms of adding additional revenue streams as you're identifying more problems. And as you go through a solution design exercise, one or more models may be best fit to address that and capture that value, provide the solution to your customer and capture that value. A lot of companies, as they've matured, they've added one or more of these other types of divisions to generate more value for their company and provide more value back to their customer. So I want you to keep that in mind as well too, as it doesn't have to be the exact same solution you've been working on. There may be others, and there also may be a sequence there where you can, for example, test it in the form of a service or a productized service first. Then if it gains real traction, which, productized service a lot easier and faster to spin up, it gains real traction and it pushes that to the breaking point. Now it's probably time to start thinking about automating some of that and adding software back. So it's kind of more of a validation process, but again, it keeps your costs and your spend low as you're testing new value propositions to solve new problems. Okay. The last one I kind of want to dive into before we basically just open it up for some questions. Yeah, well said. Good point as well, Greg. There's other elements to the software as well too that Greg just suggested, which is like setup fees, maintenance. So there's other models there as well too. You want to consider those as well. And a good benchmark there is to get an understanding in how others in your industry are doing it in terms of, is that essentially kind of best practice or expected? In some instances it may be, in other instances it may not. But if it is expected, it could almost, and you aren't offering it in that way, you might think that's a good thing, but you want to offer it in a way that the customer expects it as well too. You don't want if you're doing something differently than the customer is expecting, you need to have a story to be able to effectively communicate that with them. So don't leave necessarily any money on the table if you don't have to as well also. The partnerships element, I think, is a valuable one that will help you reach greater scale that most don't take enough, most don't invest enough into, that can generate results at an entirely different level. So at Staff Geek, for example, we're doing this where, right, we are providing a software solution at the moment. We're not looking to provide any services. What we're doing is we're finding other organizations that offer software or that offer professional services to solve different versions of the problem that we solve at a higher level, like I just described, more expensive, more customized, but have no interest in getting into the software space. And we are partnering with them. And because our offerings are similar, non-competitive, and the partnership makes sense for both parties. It increases the value that they can provide to their customer, as well as ours to our customers, in that some of our customers ask for bigger ticket, more expensive services. We don't really have an interest in getting into that space under the Staff Geek brand yet. As such, we're happy to provide those connections to these professional services firms. As such, they do the same for us because it is a great relationship. So based on what their needs are, that they don't have expertise or anything to offer their customers, they send those leads to us. We send the leads that are better fit for them to them. So that's a really effective way that we've been able to kind of grow at Staff Geek by leveraging partnership like that. So there's a lot more you could do with partnerships. At Staff Geek, we have a B2B SaaS product, HR tech product. We are also making sure that we're integrating with other software tools that our customer has as part of their tech stack. Like, for example, we are a hiring platform. There's a tool referred to as an ATS, or an applicant tracking software, or an applicant tracking systems rather. And that is used for recruiting. So they want to post a job on a job board, they use an ATS. What we do is we find out which software, like what other software tools are in the tech stack for our customer. And then we develop relationships with them, right? Because they don't offer what we offer, we don't offer what they offer. Again, same thing, good fit. In a lot of these instances, and we're probably build this at Staff Geek as well too, they have like these partnership portals where basically they can advertise to all of their customers affiliate programs for other products that are integrated with theirs. That's also a win-win. So for the products that we've integrated with, they put our domain and our product, they advertise it to their customers, sending us leads when they need solutions to those problems, and we do the same for them. That's another good area where you can leverage partnerships to grow as you kind of setting those up and you're trying to figure out different ways to reach greater scale. Okay, let me see what else I got in here. The other elements I'll add, because I know we're coming up on time here, and I want to leave some time for questions. Otherwise, we can really jump around anywhere, is I'd encourage you to take advantage of a lot of the resources that I provide and I create, my team creates. These are all things that I'm doing on a daily or weekly basis. I've got a daily product strategy email. I typically record at least one podcast a week, sometimes two. I create videos on these topics. I have a blog, and all this stuff is free. So it's available on my website. Go check it out, read it, listen to it, whatever. As you have questions about any of it, leverage this, which is my contact information. Feel free to email me, call me, whatever. Whatever I could do to help you guys out, just let me know. I'm really passionate about talking about this stuff. I could talk about this forever, so it's good that this session eventually does end, because I'll never shut up. But if you guys have questions about what you're working on, I want you to reach out, hit me up. Let me know what questions you have. Advice is free, that type of thing. So happy to point you in the right direction with the time that I have available as much as I can. But having said that, happy to open up to any other questions you guys have for those that are in attendance, or Greg or anybody, in terms of if you want me to dive further into any other areas or talk about anything else.
Well, thanks, Sean. Any questions from the people on the call?
I did have a question about, you might have mentioned this at the beginning. What's the name of your website?
Yeah, so my website, let me put that in the chat window as well too. That's a great question. It's nextstep.io, but the next is missing the E. So it's nxtstep.io.
Okay.
Here it is. I'll just drop that into the chat window as well too for you guys, if anybody wants to check that out. And then from there, you can dive into quite a bit. The podcast is linked, the blog is linked. I've got a number of different links that I can update and add to the slides, as well as share with Greg if you're interested in sharing with the community here as well too. So I've got a YouTube channel and a few other social media accounts that are pretty active about this stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Other questions from anybody? All right, if there aren't any others, Greg, I can turn it back over to you.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, here's what usually happens, Sean, is there's usually crickets at this point, although sometimes maybe not, but then tomorrow I'll get a flurry of emails and people will be saying, I was thinking I should have asked this question.
There's a lot of information to digest, so I totally get it.
I guess I do have one question. What are your thoughts on open source, using open source I guess tools to make a product, GitHub?
All about it. Yep. Whatever's cheaper, faster, and easier, especially in the beginning, is always going to be my answer. At that point, it really shouldn't matter much, I would say. If you have a very specific situation you're considering, I would use whatever is faster, cheaper, easier. Basically, keep your spend down on that stuff as much as possible and gain as much traction as you can. Because it's one of those things where it's I think a lot of folks go from idea to thinking I need to build the thing in order to sell the thing, and that answer is that's just dead wrong. So most people go to mentally. I did myself when I started my first software company, which tanked. In that I thought I needed to have the spinning rims and all that kind of stuff, and if I didn't, then I wasn't going to be able to have a conversation. What I learned was building something in isolation like that. I ended up building something that nobody wanted, so I released it to crickets. And a lot of people who've been in this space repeatedly have probably some version of a similar experience like that. So that's a really, it's a humbling experience because your expectations are very different than reality in that case. So I would recommend skipping that whole thing and instead doing whatever you can to gain as much traction as possible. And then from there, as you're gaining traction, that will significantly influence anything you're able to do from there. So push something that is as easy and fast and cheap to put together as far as you can, and you'll know when it reaches its breaking point. I want you to like use a tool like Bubble and try to break it. Like build something in there and push it to its breaking point where it has too many users and it's starting to slow down or whatever. Then at that point, you've got a good reason to build something that scales better because you want more people want access to your software. They want it to perform better, all this type of stuff. But before that, don't worry about it.
Plus,
Now,
go ahead, William. Go ahead.
just the question I had, do you ever run into problems with like legality type stuff or like copyright kind of thing with like open source? I don't know. I guess maybe not for Bubble, but like if you were to use something like on GitHub.
Yeah, I have so I went through the process of securing a trademark, I guess it was, for Staff Geek. So there's a story to that, and I would do that very differently as well. Also, obviously do whatever you need to within the bounds of the law and make sure that you are protecting yourself adequately and get the advice of professionals here who know a lot more than I do. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a CPA, those type of things. I know enough to be dangerous, but I know that at least. So that advice only goes so far. Having said that, I would always rather you kind of execute before you put too much time, effort, or resources into something that's going to slow you down considerably. In terms of like copyright and is someone going to steal my idea? Do I need to sign NDAs? All that type of stuff. My answer to that is pretty much flat no. Like just pass on as much of that as you possibly can so that you can move as fast as possible until you get to that validating the value proposition stage. Here's why, right? Because we could check all those boxes. We could have everything buttoned up. We could pay the most expensive lawyers to build everything that we need, take as long as possible. And at the end of the day, if we can't sell what we were working on, what did all of that investment get you? All you're left with is basically money you wasted. You might have the experience, but as I've already articulated, I've done that and I know it doesn't work. A lot of other people have too. And instead, that time, effort, and resources could have definitely been better spent. So I would rather you get the traction first and then move forward with everything that you're talking about now. Get it all buttoned up, make sure you have everything very well organized. I mean, there's great resources out there to get you 80-90% of the way there very cost effectively and very quickly. Like Get Terms is one of the resources that I might suggest taking a closer look at. It's basically like a terms of service, privacy policy, cookie policy generator, where it makes modular a number of the different variables that you might need to change, like your company and the address and stuff like that. But it will get you, again, 80-90% of the way there. You don't have to spend $500 an hour on a lawyer who's going to basically create a template of that version for you anyway, which those costs are really, the cost and the time to do that stuff really adds up. So wherever possible, if you're spending a lot of time or money on something, chances are you probably don't need to, unless you're at that, I've got customers that for which, I've adequately solved their problem. They're telling me that they're paying for access to this thing. If you're not at that stage yet, I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time or money into any of these things. Now, of course, there's exceptions, right? Like if you're working on medical devices or something like that, we can't really, be as progressive as we can there because we're talking about health and safety and stuff like that. So there's exceptions, but as a general rule, you can move pretty quickly with very little to get you to that traction stage. And then once you're at that traction stage, it's a whole lot easier to like secure capital or just reinvest your cash flow from operations into any of these other areas. And you're going to know what you need essentially when you get there because stuff will start breaking. And in my opinion, that's a good thing.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
And William, let us know here at the IEI what it is you're struggling with, or what you're thinking of doing, or thinking of spending money on, or what resource you need. Because, for example, in the area of legal services, we can point you to other resources. You can get a lot of free advice from lawyers, You just have to know where or how to connect to them. So whether it's IP lawyers or trademark lawyers, I mean, we have people on our Startup Tree platform who do mentoring in those areas. So, take a look or come back to me. I'm happy to help point you to some people that could, give you some free services or at least free advice and guidance. I think they would probably echo, Sean's comments as well. And Sean, thank you for stressing, like, why would you build something you don't know if anybody really wants it or not? And because you don't know if what you're going to offer them is what's going to really solve their problem. But, I hear this every year, all the time, people saying, well, if I don't have my software, how can I show anybody what it is or what it does? And guess what? There are a lot of ways to show people the benefits of what your product's going to do for them without having one working line of code. So again, that's something else we can talk, more deeply on in a separate call. But right, Sean? I mean,
yeah, there's a lot. There's so much you could do. I tell the story sometimes in terms of like a coffee mug or a water bottle, right? I don't drink any coffee, surprisingly so. But because I don't, if you're thinking of building a coffee mug and selling it to me, and you think you need the coffee mug to find out whether or not I need it, obviously you don't, right? Because all you need to do is ask me whether or not I drink coffee. And if I don't, then I'm not going to buy your product. So that's one way to think about it in terms of like, you can show it to me, you can describe it, you can find out what my needs are. You do all of those things before you invest in all the R&D to build the better mousetrap, right? And another thing I would recommend as well too is when people do like presentations or show people like demos of software and whatnot, I typically recommend not to do it live, as in don't use the software and like walk them around it. It's more awkward than you think it might be, and it slows the process down. Really, all you need is like a snapshot, an image, or something to like look at visually that says, in this part of the application, here's what you do, right? Here's my Gmail inbox. Here I can create an email, or I can favorite an email, or I can search for an email, or whatever. I don't actually need to do it in real time, like a conversation like this. It actually slows the conversation down and just introduces any potential other problems because you might have a bug or something like that. Skip all that. Instead, you can just use designs that says, here it is, right? I could show you a screenshot of that and I could talk about it until I'm blue in the face. But really what I want to do is I want to put it in front of you. I want to have you tell me what you think, right? Does this look like it would solve your problem? I want to speak as little as I can and I want to listen. As such, I want to speed that process up, and a visual is all you need. If a visual is all you need, you can just hire a great designer to design what your software would look like and create like a clickable prototype version of it, because that can give you basically very close to the full experience without actually doing anything as software yet. You can do demos with that. I highly recommend that until you get to the part where you're talking about a deal and like securing, a contract with someone. I've done projects where we haven't written a single line of code. I've had a demo deck or a pitch deck where it goes through screenshots of visuals of what the software is. We were selling to very large companies, so it's a very long sales cycle. But I've had essentially someone say go, as in, yes, I want that. And, they're ready to put their money where their mouth is, kind of thing. And at that point is when I started creating the software. So I didn't have it yet, but I said, this is what it is. This is what it's going to do. And when they said, go, I want that, and we landed a contract, they were months away from implementing it anyway, but I knew I had a deal. And that's when I started building it. And now I have the added advantage of being able to build it around them because I've got customers that genuinely need that, right? They're willing to put their money where their mouth is.
All right. Well, we've hit the 6:30 time marker here. I want to thank you, Sean, for coming in and spending your time with us, sharing your expertise, some of your words of wisdom, which I wholeheartedly endorse, and hopefully our people on the call tonight on this workshop will take to heart, because it truly will save you a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of aggravation. So I really do hope that you, listen, have taken in what Sean has said and take it to heart while you're thinking about your business and how you can take your business forward and continuing to evolve and work on your business model. So thank you, Sean. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks everybody for attending as well too. And please feel free to reach out if you have additional questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. If you want to stop sharing your screen there, and then I'm going to go ahead and just quickly finish with one or two things here. So, you know, I'm going to put this slide up. These are mostly, I'm not going to go through all these slides because they're going to be in the deck. You'll be able to take a look at them when you go back into the resource file. But this is just kind of a 10-step process. Most of these are elements that you're going to need to include somewhere in your executive summary, in your pitch deck. And it breaks it down in these steps into, you know, the desirability, which is just, do your customers have this problem? How big a problem is your solution something they really want? The viability of it is, you know, how are you stacking up against the competition? How are you delivering value that's unique? What's your unfair advantage? You know, key milestones, etc. Yep, FLD points are coming up in just a second. Describing your product and solution. There's a couple slides in here that just show you a quick way, because one of the things you have to do in your submission is you have to describe what your product is, your product or your service is as a solution to these problems, and coming up with a quick, elegant, simple way of being able to show the value you provide and the benefits you provide is really important. To this question, we've talked about this a little bit. Do I need a real working product or service to be able to you know, win the Be Your Own Boss Bowl? No, but if you have something, absolutely show it. And something could be a mock-up, it could be a screenshot, it could be you know, a wireframe or some other type of prototype. It could be even a drawing of what your intended product might look like. All right, and then again, we've talked about don't build it before you validated both the problem solution fit as well as the product market fit. All right, so two other quick examples. Dropbox, you all are familiar pretty much with the file sharing program Dropbox that was out there. So Dropbox launched with a landing page to test their concept. They did not write one single line of code, but they got 75,000 people on that website who signed up and wanted to be early adopters. They took that as validation, all right, as a sign to their investors and said, hey, look at the demand for this product. All we need is funding to go now write the code. And that's how they went about this process. And so their testing, their validation was, would anybody pay to store all this critical data up in the cloud? Because at that point in time, there really weren't too many cloud-based services doing that, all right? And it was a way for them to demonstrate traction by saying, hey, we've got 75,000 people already on our list that we can go sell this to once we have it. And another great example of that is Zappos. Zappos did not spend a nickel developing an entire e-commerce-based website with all of the back-end inventory control and procurement. They didn't do that. They put up a website that would take orders. That was it. They had no source of inventory. Their source of product was after they took an order, they sent somebody down the street to a local shoe store and they bought the shoes, brought it back to their store, wrapped them up and sent them out. They were trying to validate the concept of, would people be willing to buy shoes online? Because back then nobody was doing it. So, you know, two really good examples of you can find creative ways to validate your solution and whether or not somebody'd really be willing to use it before ever investing in developing the full software development or product development. All right, last is IP. I think I'm going to hold that. I'll hold that till next week or the week after. We'll come back to that. And then just last steps, you know, make sure you're taking advantage of the resources we're making available to you. Next week, the workshop will be on financial projections and you're developing your financial assumptions. Do your research both on your customer personas, but as well as your competition. And then start thinking of what are your key assumptions and how are you going to go about validating that? Because as you validate them, you have developed traction, which is really a critical element for investors. They want to hear your traction. And if you don't already have paying customers, which many of you won't, traction is being able to show number of people coming to your website, number of people who've signed up for information or who are offering to be alpha testers or beta testers of your product or your service. All right, and get your customer feedback. All right, workshops and other key dates. I'm going to just take you to the FLDP points for undergrads. If you're a grad student on the call, just email us at iei@temple.edu, and then we'll be able to go ahead and take care of that. All right, so hopefully you have that information. And then lastly, I'm going to go ahead and go back to this. If you'd be so kind, fill out the Qualtrics survey. It's 4 simple questions. We'd like your feedback on the programs we're running. And with that, I'll hang on. If anybody has any other questions for me, happy to answer them for you.
Greg, do you have the slide of what the requirements to enter are? Do you have that handy?
Yeah, I do.
I haven't seen that yet.
Yep, I do. Hang on just a second.
Yeah, no rush. Yeah.
Right there.
We also have this on the BYOBB website, so iei.temple.edu/BYOBB. There's an eligibility and requirements page on there, and there's a PDF with everything, including and then there's a submission guidelines document as well that details everything pretty specifically.
Perfect. In terms of like the eligibility to compete instead of like submission, I'll take a picture of that too, though. Is that a slide? Was that a slide that you guys flipped through?
I showed it a couple weeks back. I don't think I have that slide in this deck. Let me.
It's all good. I can go to the website.
Yeah, there is a website on the web. Yeah, I don't have it in this deck. On the website, we do have a whole eligibility requirements. It basically centers around how old is your company, how much money has your company raised in terms of investment, or how much gross revenue have you earned? Okay, and there's caps on those. The other thing is, of course, the lead of the team has to have a Temple affiliation, even though the other members of the team do not. Okay, but there has to be at least one person with a Temple affiliation, and that should be the lead of the team. I think they're the major ones.